Somewhere in the faded ledgers of Southampton County, Virginia, buried beneath decades of deliberate silence and comfortable forgetting, there exists a single line of ink that changed nothing and everything at once. Amos, born 1818, field hand, property of Joseph Redhill. 10 words, a life reduced to inventory, like a plow or a mule or a sack of seed corn. But what those words don't tell you, what no ledger could ever hold, is what it meant to be that line of ink. To wake every morning at the sound of a horn you did not choose, to work land you would never own, to love people you could lose with a single stroke of a pen. This is the story of a man named Amos, and the night in 1850 when he stopped being property and started running for his life. Before we continue, if you're new here, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. We bring you the stories history tried to bury, the ones that don't make it into textbooks because they're too raw, too real, too close to the bone. And leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We want to know who's listening when we tell the truth. Now, let's go back to Virginia, to tobacco fields and dirt floors and a quiet so thick it could choke you. Southampton County, Virginia, September 1850. The Red Hill plantation sat low and wide in the tidewater country, where the soil was red as rust and the air in summer hung heavy enough to drown in. It wasn't the biggest plantation in the county. Joseph Redhill owned 43 people, not hundreds. But it was run with the kind of cold efficiency that made men like Redhill rich and men like Amos old before their time. Tobacco was the crop. Backbreaking, all-consuming, unforgiving tobacco. It required constant attention, planting, suckering, topping, worming, priming. The leaves had to be stripped at exactly the right time, or the whole crop could sour. And if the crop soured, someone had to pay for it. That someone was never Joseph Redhill. Amos had been born on this land 32 years earlier, in a cabin identical to the one he lived in now. His mother, Leah, had worked the fields until she died of fever when Amos was 11. His father remained a question no one asked aloud. Leah had been sent to work at a neighboring plantation for 3 months in 1817, came back quiet and pregnant, and never spoke of it again. Amos learned early that silence was survival. He learned which rows to pick and which to leave for the slower workers so the overseer's whip wouldn't fall as hard. He learned to keep his face blank when the white children threw rocks at him on the road to church. He learned that hoping for tomorrow was dangerous, but hoping for nothing at all would kill you faster than any overseer's lash. By the time he was 14, Amos was already broad across the shoulders, strong enough to lift a full hogshead of tobacco without help. Redhill noticed. That year, Amos was moved from light work to the first gang, the hardest, fastest workers who set the pace for everyone else. He was 23 when he met Delphine. She had been sold to Redhill in the spring of 1841, part of an estate sale from a bankrupt planter down in Nansemond County. Delphine was 19, small-boned and quick-handed, with eyes that looked at you like she could see straight through to the back of your skull. Redhill's wife, Constance, took one look at Delphine's neat movements and assigned her to the kitchen. That was a mercy in its way. Kitchen work was still brutal. Up before dawn, fires to tend, endless cooking and cleaning. But it kept you out of the fields. It kept you closer to the big house, where sometimes there were scraps of information, fragments of news from the outside world. Amos first saw Delphine at a corn husking in late autumn. The work was done communal style. All the hands gathered in the barn, singing to keep the rhythm, while the pile of pale husks grew higher and higher. Delphine sat near the door, her fingers flying over the ears of corn, and when Amos sat down beside her, she didn't look up, but her hands slowed just slightly, a recognition without words. Amos stayed beside her the rest of that night, and when the work was done and the hands drifted back to the quarters, he walked her to the women's cabin. No words passed between them, but something had been established, something that didn't require permission or explanation. They were married 6 months later. Not legally, of course. Enslaved people couldn't marry legally. But the preacher who came through once a month, a white man who believed slaves had souls worth saving, if not lives worth freeing, agreed to say words over them. Amos and Delphine stood in the quarter's meeting ground, holding hands while the preacher read from his Bible about love and faithfulness and union before God. Joseph Redhill allowed it because married slaves, he believed, were more stable, less likely to run, more invested in staying put. He wasn't wrong, but he also wasn't right, because what men like Redhill never understood was that love didn't make you weaker. It made you more dangerous. It gave you something worth protecting, something worth dying for. Amos and Delphine moved into a cabin together. 1 room, dirt floor, a stone fireplace that smoked more than it warmed. They had nothing. A pallet stuffed with corn shucks. A skillet Delphine had been given as a wedding gift from the other kitchen women. A wooden bucket for water. But they had each other. And in a world built to strip you of everything human, that was a revolution in itself. Ruth was born in 1841, just after the harvest. Delphine labored for 14 hours in that smoky cabin, with only the midwife, a woman named Parthenia, who'd delivered half the babies in the quarters, to help her. Amos wasn't allowed inside. Men weren't, not during birthing. So he stood outside in the September heat, listening to Delphine's cries, feeling more helpless than he'd ever felt, working tobacco under the overseer's eye. When Parthenia finally stepped out and nodded toward the door, Amos's knees nearly buckled. He went inside. Delphine was soaked in sweat, her hair stuck to her face, but she was smiling. She held a tiny, wrinkled thing wrapped in a flour sack, and when she looked up at Amos, her eyes were shining. The baby's name was Ruth, a Bible name, a name that meant something about loyalty, about following, about refusing to be left behind. Amos reached out one rough, tobacco-stained finger and touched his daughter's cheek. The smallness of her terrified him, the absolute vulnerability. Ruth was 3 days old when Joseph Redhill came to see her. It wasn't a social visit. Redhill didn't care about babies unless they represented future value. He stood in the doorway of the cabin, looked at Ruth with the same expression he'd used to evaluate a calf, and made a brief comment about her appearing healthy. Strong enough for kitchen work in a few years. Then he left. Delphine didn't cry. She just held Ruth a little tighter, her jaw set in that way Amos had learned to recognize. The look that said she was storing something up, saving it for later when there was time to feel it. Ruth belonged to Joseph Redhill, legally, completely, irrevocably. And if Redhill decided tomorrow to sell her to a trader heading to New Orleans. There was nothing Amos could do but watch her go. Josiah was born 5 years later, in 1846. By then, Amos had learned to carry the weight of fatherhood, the way he carried hogsheads of tobacco, low and steady, never letting anyone see how much it hurt. Josiah was small, quieter than Ruth had been, with Delphine's sharp eyes and Amos's broad hands. Amos loved him so fiercely it scared him, because every time he looked at his children, he saw the futures they would never have. Ruth would grow up cooking in a kitchen that wasn't hers, serving food to white children who would never see her as human. Josiah would go to the fields as soon as he was old enough to hold a hoe, his back bent under the same sun that had bent Amos's, his life measured in harvests and scars. And there was nothing Amos could do. Nothing. That was the weight every enslaved parent carried, the knowledge that love was not enough, that no matter how hard you worked, how obedient you were, how carefully you navigated the rules of a system designed to break you, your children were not yours. They were property, and property could be sold. The overseer at Red Hill was a man named Lucius Gwaltney. He was 42, lean as a whip, with a sunburned face and pale eyes that looked at black people the way you'd look at mules, useful if they worked, disposable if they didn't. Gwaltney had a habit of humming hymns while he rode the rows, something cheerful and discordant that made the silence afterward feel even heavier. He rode a gray mare he'd named Duchess, and he carried a braided leather whip he called the Persuader. He used it liberally. Too slow in the rows? The Persuader. Talked back? The Persuader. Looked at him wrong? The Persuader. Amos had felt it more times than he could count. The worst time had been in the summer of 1848. The tobacco was late that year, the heat unbearable, and Amos had straightened up for just a moment to wipe the sweat from his eyes. Gwaltney saw. The whip cracked across Amos's shoulders so hard it knocked him forward into the dirt. Then again, and again. Gwaltney didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The whip did the talking. The message was always the same. You rest when permitted. You move when ordered. You exist at someone else's pleasure. Amos, face down in the red dirt, gave the only answer that kept you alive, the words of compliance that had been beaten into him since childhood. That night, Delphine cleaned the cuts on his back with water from the rain barrel, her hands gentle, but her face hard as stone. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. This was the world they lived in. But Ruth, 9 years old and already too smart for her own safety, watched from the corner of the cabin with her fists clenched tight enough that her knuckles went pale. Amos thought, she's going to grow up hating, and I don't know how to stop it. Don't know if I should. September 1850 brought news that changed everything. The Fugitive Slave Act had passed. Most of the people in the quarters didn't know what that meant at first. News traveled slow when you couldn't read, and no one would tell you the truth. But whispers came through, from hired-out hands who'd been to Richmond, from free black men who worked the docks, from a preacher who let something slip during a sermon. The new law said this: Any black person, anywhere in the country, could be arrested on nothing more than a white man's word. No trial, no defense, just a commissioner who got paid $10 to rule you a slave and $5 to set you free. The mathematics of injustice built right into the system. Even the North wasn't safe now. People who'd escaped years ago, who'd built new lives in Philadelphia or Boston or New York, were being dragged back south in chains. Families were torn apart. Free black people, born free, never enslaved, were kidnapped off the streets and sold. The message was clear. There was no freedom, not anywhere, not for anyone. Amos heard the news from a man he'd never seen before. It was late September, just after the second priming. The tobacco was nearly finished, and the quarters had that exhausted, brittle quiet that came at the end of a hard season. The stranger appeared just after dark. He moved between the cabins like smoke, never stopping long enough to be noticed, but visible enough that people saw him and knew he wasn't one of Red Hill's hands. He was light-skinned, could almost pass for white if the light was dim, and he carried himself with the careful confidence of a man who'd learned to walk the line between free and enslaved. Amos was sitting outside his cabin, smoking a short pipe he'd traded for, when the man sat down beside him without asking permission. The stranger knew Amos's name, knew it without being told. He spoke quickly, barely above a whisper. There was a boat, Dismal Swamp Canal, 2 weeks from that night, midnight departure. If you could reach it, you could reach Norfolk. From Norfolk, passage north could be arranged. Then the man stood, brushed the dirt off his pants, and disappeared into the dark as suddenly as he'd arrived. Amos sat there for a long time, the pipe cold in his hand, staring at nothing. Inside the cabin, Delphine was putting the children to bed. He could hear Ruth's voice, asking some question he couldn't make out. He could hear Josiah's small laugh, the sound of it so pure and unguarded it made Amos's chest ache. 2 weeks. He had 2 weeks to decide if he was going to risk everything, his life, his family, the fragile stability they'd built in this brutal place, for a chance that might be a lie. Or if he was going to stay, keep his head down, survive. That night, Amos didn't sleep. He lay beside Delphine in the dark, her hand in his, and felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him like a hogshead of tobacco he couldn't lift. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and went silent. The first thing Amos did after the stranger left was nothing. He sat outside his cabin for another hour, smoking the last of his tobacco, listening to the sounds of the quarters settling into sleep. Somewhere down the row, a baby cried and was hushed. A man coughed, deep and wet, the kind of cough that meant his lungs were giving out. The night insects sang their endless song, indifferent to human suffering. Amos stayed perfectly still, his face blank, his body relaxed, because even in the dark, you never knew who might be watching, who might notice a change in posture, a tension in the shoulders, something in the eyes that suggested a man was thinking thoughts he shouldn't think. When he finally went inside, Delphine was already asleep, curled on her side with Josiah tucked against her chest. Ruth had her own small pallet in the corner, her breathing soft and steady. Amos lay down beside his wife, careful not to wake her, and stared at the roof beams. 2 weeks. 14 nights to decide if he would risk everything for a chance that might not even exist. 14 nights to prepare for something he couldn't tell anyone about, not even Delphine. Especially not Delphine, because if he told her, she would have to carry that knowledge. And if they were discovered, if someone suspected, if an overseer asked the right questions, she would be forced to choose between protecting him and protecting their children. He would not put that weight on her, so he said nothing, but he began to prepare. Night 1, Sunday, September 22nd. After the evening meal, cornmeal mush and a piece of salt pork so small it barely counted, Amos stayed outside longer than usual. He walked the perimeter of the quarters, slow and casual, like a man stretching his legs after a long day. What he was really doing was counting the dogs. There were 5 on the Red Hill property, 3 hunting hounds that slept in a pen near the overseer's cabin, and 2 that roamed loose at night. The loose ones were the problem. They knew every person on the plantation by scent, and they'd been trained to bark at strangers. Amos needed to know their patterns, where they went, when they slept, whether they could be avoided or would have to be dealt with. He noted the location of the overseer's cabin, 200 yards from the quarters, with a clear sightline to the main road. Gwaltney slept light. Everyone knew that. You couldn't sneak past his place without serious planning. Amos also studied the patrol routes. Southampton County had organized slave patrols that rode the roads at night, checking passes, looking for runaways. They came through Red Hill's land roughly every 3 nights, always between 10 and midnight. If Amos was going to move, it would have to be after midnight, after the patrols had passed, in the darkest part of the night, when even the dogs grew tired. He filed all of this away, his face empty, his movements unhurried, just a man taking a walk, nothing to see. Night 2, Monday, September 23rd. Amos began hiding food. Not much. You couldn't take much without it being noticed. The rations were measured out precisely. So many pounds of cornmeal per person per week, so much salt pork, so many sweet potatoes. If you took extra, someone would know. But small amounts could disappear. A handful of cornmeal pocketed during distribution, a piece of pone wrapped in a rag and tucked under the cabin steps, a half-burned sweet potato salvaged from the fire and hidden in the woodpile. Amos spread the theft across days, never taking from the same source twice. He hid the food in different locations so that if one cache was discovered, the others would remain safe. He also began setting aside other necessities. A tin cup with a tight-fitting lid, useful for carrying water. A piece of flint he'd found in the fields, good for starting fires. A length of rope he'd scavenged from a broken harness, thin enough to coil small, but strong enough to hold weight. Every item was chosen carefully, every hiding place was deliberate, and every night, after Delphine and the children were asleep, Amos lay awake, going over the plan. Not the whole plan. He didn't know the whole plan. The stranger hadn't given him details, hadn't told him exactly where the boat would be, or who would be on it. But Amos knew this much. He had to get from Red Hill Plantation to the dismal swamp canal. That was roughly 18 miles through woods and swamp, across roads patrolled by armed men, past plantations with dogs and overseers who shot first and asked questions later. 18 miles. He'd never been more than 5 miles from Red Hill in his entire life. Night 3, Tuesday, September 24th. Amos traded his Sunday shirt. He'd owned that shirt for 6 years, the only piece of clothing he had that wasn't work-worn and filthy. It was clean, relatively whole, the kind of shirt you wore to the monthly preaching or to a wedding. He traded it to a young man named Jacob, a free-issue boy who worked odd jobs around the plantation and had access to things enslaved people didn't. What Amos got in return was a broken file, the kind used for sharpening tools. The file's edge was cracked and dull, but it was still metal, still hard enough to cut through iron if you had time and patience. Amos didn't know if he'd need it, didn't know if there would be chains or shackles or locked doors between him and freedom. But if there were, he wanted options. He hid the file inside the cabin, wedged into a gap between 2 floorboards where Delphine wouldn't find it during her daily sweeping. Then he went to work as usual, his face calm, his movements steady. That night, Ruth asked him where his Sunday shirt had gone. She was 9 years old, observant in the dangerous way that smart children were. She noticed things, remembered things, asked questions that could get people hurt. Amos told her he'd torn it working and thrown it away. His voice was even, his expression unchanged. Ruth looked at him for a long moment, her eyes too sharp, too knowing. Then she nodded and went back to her dinner. But Amos saw the way Delphine glanced at him across the cabin, saw the slight narrowing of her eyes, the pause before she turned back to the fire. She knew something was different. She didn't ask, but she knew. Night 4, Wednesday, September 25th. Amos began memorizing the land. During the day, while working the tobacco rows, he paid attention to things he'd never bothered noticing before. The position of the sun at different hours, the direction of the prevailing wind, the places where the woods grew thickest, where a man might move without being seen. He studied the roads. There were 2 main routes off Red Hill's land, the county road that ran north toward Jerusalem, and a smaller wagon track that curved east toward the river. Both would be patrolled. Both would be dangerous. But between the roads, through the woods, there were deer trails, narrow paths worn by animals moving between water sources and feeding grounds, paths that didn't appear on any map, that white men didn't know existed. Amos had hunted those woods as a boy, back when Red Hill's father had allowed limited hunting to supplement rations. He remembered some of the trails, not all, but some. He began rebuilding that mental map, piece by piece. The old oak struck by lightning 3 years ago, its trunk split and blackened. The creek that ran brown with tannin, too shallow to drown in, but deep enough to kill a scent trail. The abandoned tobacco barn on the edge of Red Hill's property, its roof caved in, but its walls still standing. Landmarks, reference points, a path through the wilderness that existed only in his memory. That night he lay beside Delphine and traced the route in his mind. From the cabin to the wood line, 200 yards, open ground, maximum exposure. From the woodline to the creek, 1/2 mile through dense pine. From the creek to the old barn, another mile, rougher terrain. And from there, he didn't know. The dismal swamp was farther east, a vast wetland where runaway slaves had hidden for generations. Some said there were entire communities deep in the swamp, Maroons who'd built lives beyond the reach of white authority. Amos didn't know if that was true, didn't know if he'd find help there or just more danger. But the swamp was where the canal ran, and the canal was where the boat would be. If the stranger had been telling the truth, if this wasn't a trap, if Amos wasn't walking into his own death. Night 5, Thursday, September 26th. The patrol came through early that night, just after 9. Amos heard the horses before he saw them, the heavy thud of hooves on packed dirt, the jingle of bridles, the low voices of white men who didn't bother being quiet because they didn't need to be. Everyone in the quarters went still. Patrol nights were dangerous. Sometimes the riders just passed through, checking that everyone was accounted for. Sometimes they stopped, demanded to see passes, questioned people about where they'd been and why. Sometimes they dragged someone out of their cabin for no reason except that they could. Amos stood in his doorway, making himself visible but not provocative, hands at his sides, face neutral. The patrol consisted of 4 men, all mounted, all carrying rifles. Their leader was a thick-shouldered man named Cobb, who owned a small farm adjoining Red Hill's property. Cobb had a reputation for cruelty that made even other patrollers uncomfortable. The riders moved slowly through the quarters, their eyes scanning cabins, counting faces. One of them called out to Gwaltney, who'd come out of his cabin with a lantern. There was a brief conversation Amos couldn't hear, then laughter. Then the patrol moved on, heading toward the main road. Amos waited until the sound of hooves faded completely before stepping back inside. His heart was hammering. His hands were shaking. Because he'd just realized something that made his plan infinitely more complicated. The patrols weren't predictable. They came every few nights, yes, but not on a set schedule. Sometimes early, sometimes late. Sometimes they rode the roads. Sometimes they cut through properties. There was no way to guarantee they wouldn't be out there on the night Amos tried to run. No way to know if he'd make it a mile before being caught. He sat down on the edge of the pallet, his breath coming hard. Delphine was nursing Josiah, her back to him, but her shoulders were tense. She'd felt it too, the fear, the randomness, the complete lack of control. After a while she spoke, her voice low. She didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. She just said his name, once, soft, and Amos understood what she was telling him. I know something is happening. I know you're keeping it from me, and I'm afraid. He wanted to reach for her, wanted to pull her close and tell her everything and let her decide with him. But he didn't, because the only way to protect her was to keep her ignorant. So he said nothing, and the distance between them, always present but usually bearable, widened into something that hurt worse than any whip. Night 6, Friday, September 27th. Amos started saying goodbye without saying goodbye. He did it in small ways, touching Ruth's hair when she sat beside him at dinner, letting his hand linger a moment longer than usual. watching Josiah play with a corn-husk doll Delphine had made, memorizing the way his small hands moved, the sound of his laugh. He studied Delphine's face when she thought he wasn't looking, the line of her jaw, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the exact shade of brown in her eyes. He was storing them up, building a reservoir of memory to carry with him into whatever came next. Because Amos had made his decision. He didn't know when it had happened, whether it was the first night after the stranger came, or the third night when he hid the file, or the fifth night when the patrol rode through, and he realized he might die here if he didn't move. But somewhere in those dark hours, lying beside his family in a cabin that would never be his, Amos had decided he was going. Not because he wanted to leave them. God, he didn't want to leave them. But because staying meant watching Ruth grow into a woman who would be used the way his mother had been used. Staying meant watching Josiah's spirit break under the weight of men like Gwaltney. Staying meant dying slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of Amos except a line in a ledger. And he couldn't do that. He couldn't. So he began the terrible work of letting go. Night 7, Saturday, September 28th. The Sabbath. Red Hill allowed his enslaved people to rest on Sundays, or at least to rest from field work. There were still chores, wood to chop, water to haul, animals to tend, but the rhythm was slower, less brutal. The monthly preacher wasn't scheduled until the following week, so there was no formal service. But some of the older folks gathered in the yard between cabins and sang hymns, old songs passed down through generations, with words that meant one thing on the surface and something else underneath. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Amos stood at the edge of the gathering, listening. He didn't sing, never had been much for singing, but he listened, and the words settled into him like stones. Carry me home. Where was home for a man who'd never been free? Was it the land of his birth, this Virginia soil soaked in blood and tobacco? Was it some northern city where black people could walk without passes, where children could learn to read without risking the lash? Or was home just an idea, a place that existed only in the moment between captivity and death? Amos didn't know. He watched Ruth and Josiah playing with the other children, their voices high and bright. He watched Delphine talking with the kitchen women, her hands moving as she described some recipe or technique. Normal. It all looked so normal. But underneath, Amos could feel the current pulling at him, the decision already made, the clock already ticking. 7 nights gone, 7 nights remaining. Night 8, Sunday, September 29th. Amos tested his route for the first time. Not the whole route, that would be suicide, but the first leg, the part he could attempt without being gone long enough to raise suspicion. He waited until after the evening meal, until the last light had faded and the quarters had settled. Then he told Delphine he was going to check the tobacco barn. Sometimes rats got into the drying sheds, and you had to set traps. It was a thin excuse. Delphine looked at him with those sharp eyes that saw too much, but she nodded. Amos walked toward the barn, casual and unhurried. But when he reached the edge of the cleared ground, he slipped into the tree line and kept going. The woods at night were a different world.
Sound traveled strangely. Close things seemed far away. Distant things seemed right beside you. The darkness was absolute under the tree canopy, broken only by occasional gaps where moonlight filtered through. Amos moved slowly, testing each step before putting his weight down, feeling for branches that might crack, for ground that might give way. He found the creek exactly where he remembered it, the water running quiet and dark. He found the lightning-struck oak, its blackened trunk visible even in the dim light. He made it 1/2 mile before turning back. The whole trip took less than an hour, but when Amos emerged from the woods, his shirt was soaked with sweat and his heart was racing. He'd done it, moved through the dark without being seen, without being caught. But 1/2 mile wasn't 18 miles, and an hour's walk on familiar ground wasn't the same as a night-long flight through unknown territory with dogs and armed men hunting you. Still, it was something. He returned to the cabin. Delphine was waiting, sitting by the fire, her hands busy with mending. She didn't ask where he'd been, didn't mention that checking a barn shouldn't take an hour. She just looked at him. And in that look, Amos saw everything she wasn't saying. "I know."
"I'm terrified. Please don't go. Please come back." He wanted to go to her, wanted to hold her and promise things he had no right to promise. But he just nodded once and lay down on the pallet. The distance between them was unbearable now. Night 9, Monday, September 30th. Ruth asked him a question that nearly broke him. They were sitting outside after dinner, the two of them, watching the fireflies rise from the grass. Josiah was already asleep inside. Delphine was cleaning the cooking pot. Ruth was quiet for a long time. Then she said, her voice small, "Did you know someone who ran away once?" Amos went very still. Running away wasn't something you talked about, not openly, not where anyone might hear. It was the ultimate transgression, the unforgivable sin in the slaveholder's gospel. But Ruth was looking at him with her mother's sharp eyes, and Amos realized she wasn't asking about running in general. She was asking about him. He thought about lying, about deflecting, about protecting her from dangerous knowledge. Instead, he said, "Yes, I knew someone." Ruth nodded, like this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Then she asked, "Did they make it?" Amos didn't know. The person he was thinking of, a young man named Samuel, who disappeared 3 years ago, had never been heard from again. Maybe he'd made it north. Maybe he'd died in the swamp. Maybe he'd been caught and sold so far away his name would never reach back to Virginia. "I don't know," Amos said honestly. Ruth was quiet again. Then, "If someone ran away and made it, would they ever come back?" The question landed like a blade between Amos's ribs, because that was what she was really asking. "If you leave, will I ever see you again?" Amos looked at his daughter, 9 years old, too smart, too aware, carrying questions she was too young to bear, and told her the only truth he could manage. Sometimes people have to go away to survive, but that doesn't mean they stop loving the people they left behind. Ruth nodded slowly. Then she stood, brushed the dirt from her dress, and went inside. Amos sat there in the dark, alone with the fireflies and the crushing weight of what he was about to do. Night 10, Tuesday, October 1st. The patrol came through again. This time they stopped. Cobb and his men dismounted in the yard between cabins, their faces hard, their rifles held loose but ready. Gwaltney came out to meet them, and there was a brief conversation that ended with Gwaltney pointing toward the far end of the quarters. The patrollers walked between the cabins, looking into doorways, counting people. When they reached Amos's cabin, Cobb stopped. He looked at Amos, looked at Delphine, looked at the children. Then he asked Gwaltney, "This one got a pass to be off the property?" Gwaltney checked his records. "No passes issued this week." Cobb grunted, satisfied. Then he looked back at Amos and said something that made Amos's blood freeze. "You look familiar. I seen you before?" Amos kept his face blank. "No, sir. I don't leave the plantation." Cobb studied him for another long moment. Then he shrugged and moved on. But the message was clear. They were watching, paying attention, noticing faces. If Amos ran, they'd know exactly who to look for. Night 11, Wednesday, October 2nd. Amos retrieved all his hidden supplies and consolidated them. The food, cornmeal, pone, dried sweet potato, went into a cloth sack Delphine had sewn years ago for carrying laundry. It wasn't much, maybe enough for 3 days if he rationed carefully. The tin cup, the flint, the rope, the file, all of it fit into a small bundle he could tie to his belt and hide under his shirt. He tested the weight, tested how it moved when he walked, made sure nothing rattled or shifted noticeably. Then he hid everything under the cabin, wedged into the crawl space beneath the floorboards. Ready. He was ready. 3 nights left. Night 12, Thursday, October 3rd. Amos couldn't eat. Delphine had made a stew from scraps, greens and a bit of pork fat, stretched thin to feed all 4 of them. It smelled good, but when Amos tried to swallow, his throat closed. Delphine noticed. Of course she noticed. She served the children first, making sure they ate. Then she sat beside Amos and placed her hand over his. She didn't say anything, didn't ask questions, just held his hand. And Amos understood what she was telling him. "Whatever you're about to do, I can't stop you. But I'm here. Right now, I'm here." He turned his hand over, laced his fingers through hers, and held on. They sat like that until the fire burned down to embers. Night 13, Friday, October 4th. The second to last night. Amos didn't prepare anything, didn't check supplies, or test routes, or count dogs. He just spent time with his family. He played with Josiah, letting the boy climb on his back and ride him like a horse. He listened to Ruth tell a long, winding story about something that had happened in the kitchen that day. He sat with Delphine while she mended clothes, watching her hands move, memorizing the rhythm of her breathing. Normal. He tried to make everything feel normal. But Ruth kept looking at him with those too knowing eyes. And Delphine's hand kept finding his, holding on a little tighter than necessary. They knew. Not the details, not the plan, but they knew something was ending. That night, after the children were asleep, Delphine lay with her back against Amos's chest, his arm wrapped around her. She whispered his name, just once, and Amos whispered back, "I love you. I have always loved you. I will always love you." It wasn't goodbye. He wouldn't let it be goodbye, but it was as close as he could come. Delphine didn't cry. She never cried, but her breathing changed, became uneven, and Amos knew she was holding it all in, storing it up for when he was gone. He held her until she fell asleep. Then he lay awake, listening to her breathe, memorizing the sound. Night 14, Saturday, October 5th. The day was endless. Amos worked the tobacco rows like always, stripped leaves, loaded hogsheads, kept his face blank and his movements steady. But inside, every nerve was screaming, "Tonight, tonight, tonight." Waltney rode past on his gray mare, humming one of his hymns. Amos didn't look up, didn't give him any reason to stop. The hours crawled. When the horn finally blew for the end of work, Amos walked back to the quarters with the other hands, moving neither too fast nor too slow. Just another exhausted man heading home. Delphine had made cornbread for dinner. Real cornbread, not just mush. She must have saved extra meal from somewhere, traded something to get it. She served Amos first. Their eyes met across the cabin, and Amos saw everything she couldn't say. "Please don't do this. Please be safe. Please come back. Please." He ate the cornbread slowly, tasting every bite, knowing it might be the last meal she ever made for him. After dinner, Amos did something he rarely did. He gathered his children, one on each knee, and held them. Ruth was too old for this, really, too grown to be held like a baby. But she didn't protest. She just leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. Josiah chattered about something, a bug he'd seen, a song he'd learned, and Amos listened to every word, storing it up. When it was time for bed, Amos tucked them in himself. He pressed his lips to Ruth's forehead and whispered, "You're smart. You're strong. Don't ever forget that." He kissed Josiah's small cheek and whispered, "Be good for your mama." Then he stepped back before his voice could break. Delphine was waiting by the door. She looked at him, and the weight of everything unsaid hung between them like smoke. Amos wanted to tell her, wanted to explain that he wasn't abandoning them, that he was doing this for them, that if he made it north, he would find a way to buy their freedom, to bring them to him. But those were promises he couldn't make, dreams that might never come true. So he just pulled her close, buried his face in her hair, and breathed her in. She held him so tight it hurt. Then she let go. She didn't cry, didn't beg him to stay, didn't ask him where he was going or when he'd be back. She just looked at him with those eyes that saw everything, and she said 5 words that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "If you don't come back, I'll know you made it. And I'll tell the children their daddy walked north until his feet touched free ground." Amos couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. He nodded once. Then he turned and walked outside into the October night before he lost the courage to move. The quarters were quiet. Most people were already asleep, exhausted from another week of brutal labor. Amos waited. He sat outside his cabin, smoking a pipe he'd borrowed, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. Midnight came, then 1 in the morning. Amos listened to the night. No dogs barking, no horses on the road. The patrol had already passed through hours earlier. It was time. He stood slowly, his legs shaking. He retrieved his bundle from under the cabin, the food, the tools, everything he'd hidden over 2 weeks of careful preparation. He tied it to his belt, checked that it was secure, and took one last look at the cabin. Inside, his family slept. Ruth and Josiah on their pallets, Delphine on the bed they'd shared for 9 years. He wanted to go back inside, wanted to kiss them one more time, to hold Delphine and tell her he was sorry, so sorry, for all of it. But if he went back inside, he would never leave. So Amos turned away. He walked to the edge of the clearing, past the other cabins, past the overseer's house where Gwaltney slept with his rifle by the bed, past the tobacco barn and the storage sheds. He reached the tree line and stopped. Behind him, everything he had ever known, everyone he had ever loved. Ahead, darkness, uncertainty, dogs and patrols, and 18 miles of hostile country between him and a boat that might not even exist. Amos took one breath, then another. Then he stepped into the woods. The darkness swallowed him whole. The woods at night were not silent. That was the first thing Amos learned as he moved away from the quarters, away from the only home he'd ever known. The darkness was full of sound, insects singing their endless chorus, branches creaking in the wind, small animals moving through the underbrush. An owl called from somewhere overhead, its voice low and mournful. Amos moved slowly, testing each step before committing his weight. The bundle at his belt pressed against his ribs. The tin cup rattled once, soft, and he froze, holding his breath. Nothing. No shouts, no dogs barking, no lanterns lighting up behind him. He kept moving. The first half-mile was the easiest because he'd practiced it. He knew where the creek ran, knew where the fallen oak created a natural bridge, knew which paths the deer used to move between feeding grounds. But beyond that half-mile, Amos was walking into the unknown. The moon was a sliver, barely giving any light. Clouds moved across it periodically, plunging the world into absolute darkness. Amos had to stop during those moments, standing perfectly still until his eyes adjusted enough to see the faint outline of trees against the slightly less dark sky. Time became meaningless. He didn't know if he'd been walking for an hour or 3, didn't know how far he'd come or how far he had left to go. All he knew was forward, north, away. He crossed the creek, wading waist-deep through water so cold it took his breath. The current pulled at him, trying to knock him off balance, but he held firm, feeling for solid ground with each step. On the far bank, he stopped to wring out his shirt and pants as much as possible. Wet clothes would slow him down, make him cold, leave a trail. The file in his bundle had gotten wet. The cornmeal, too, probably ruined. Nothing to be done about it now. Amos kept moving. The dogs found his scent 2 hours before dawn. Amos heard them first, distant barking, far behind but unmistakable. The sound every enslaved person learned to fear from childhood. Hounds on a trail, voices high and excited, getting closer. His heart kicked into his throat. He started running.
Not full speed. He couldn't afford to exhaust himself, couldn't risk a turned ankle or a fall in the dark. But faster, pushing through branches that tore at his face and arms, stumbling over roots he couldn't see. The barking got louder. Amos's mind raced. The creek should have killed his scent, should have broken the trail. But maybe he hadn't gone far enough in the water. Maybe the hounds were too good. Maybe someone had seen him leave and raised the alarm faster than he'd anticipated. He needed to break the trail, needed to do something they wouldn't expect. Up ahead, through the trees, Amos saw a break in the canopy, moonlight reflecting off water. Another creek, wider than the first, or maybe. He pushed through the last of the brush and stopped. Not a creek, a swamp. Black water stretched out before him, studded with cypress knees and half-submerged logs. Mist hung over the surface, thick and ghostly. The air smelled of rot and standing water. The dismal swamp. He'd made it farther than he'd thought. Behind him, the dogs were getting closer. He could hear men's voices now, shouting to each other. Couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear. They were hunting. Amos didn't hesitate. He waded into the swamp. The water was warmer than the creek had been, which somehow made it worse. It felt alive, thick, full of things he couldn't see. His feet sank into soft mud with each step. Something brushed against his leg. A fish, a snake, he didn't know, and he bit down hard to keep from crying out. He kept going, moving deeper, until the water reached his chest.
The dogs reached the edge of the swamp and went wild. Amos, hidden in the mist 20 yards out, watched as lanterns appeared through the trees. 4 men on foot, 2 on horseback. The riders held the lanterns high, trying to see into the dark water. One of the dogs tried to follow Amos into the swamp, but yelped and scrambled back, unwilling to go deeper. Good. Even hunting dogs had limits. The men conferred. Amos couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see their gestures, pointing into the swamp, shaking heads. One man clearly wanted to follow. Another was refusing. Finally, one of the riders called out, his voice carrying across the water. "We know you're in there. Ain't no way through that swamp in the dark. You'll drown or get bit by a moccasin before you make it 100 yards. Come on out now, and we'll go easy on you." Amos didn't move, didn't breathe. The man waited, then called again. "Last chance. We can wait here till dawn and track you easy once it's light. Or you can come out now and save yourself a beating." Amos pressed himself lower in the water, only his head above the surface. The mist swirled around him. A mosquito landed on his face, and he let it bite, didn't dare swat it away. The men waited another 10 minutes. Then one of them said something Amos couldn't hear, and they started to withdraw. But they didn't leave entirely. Through the mist, Amos could see the glow of their lanterns settling into position. They were making camp, setting up to wait for dawn. Which meant Amos couldn't go back the way he'd come. He had to go forward, through the swamp, in the dark. The dismal swamp was well named. Amos moved through it inch by inch, feeling ahead with his feet for solid ground, testing each step before committing. Sometimes what looked like solid earth turned out to be floating vegetation that gave way under his weight, plunging him chest deep into water. Other times he'd step on what he thought was a submerged log, only to have it shift. A real log, or something alive, he never knew. The mist grew thicker as the night wore on. Amos lost all sense of direction. He tried to keep the North Star in sight, but the canopy was too dense, the mist too heavy. He just kept moving, away from the lights behind him, toward, he hoped, the canal. Hours passed. Amos's legs were numb from the waist down. His hands were torn from grabbing at branches and cypress knees to keep his balance. Something had bitten him on the arm. He'd felt the sharp pain, but couldn't see what it was in the dark. He was exhausted, cold despite the warm water, starting to shake. And then, through the mist, he heard something. Water, moving water. Not the still, stagnant pools of the swamp, but current, flow, the canal. It had to be. Amos pushed forward, faster now, less careful. His foot caught on a submerged root, and he went down, face first, into the water. He came up gasping, spitting out swamp water that tasted of mud and decay. But ahead, yes, definitely ahead, he could see a break in the trees, a straight line cutting through the wilderness, the canal. Amos hauled himself up onto the bank, his muscles screaming. He lay there for a moment, chest heaving, too exhausted to move. Then he heard voices. He froze, not behind him, ahead, on the canal. Amos crawled forward on his belly, moving as quietly as he could, until he could see through the reeds at the water's edge. There was a boat, a flat-bottomed barge, maybe 30 feet long, tied up at the bank. A single lantern hung from a pole at the stern, casting a small circle of light. 2 men stood on the deck. One was white, middle-aged, with the rough clothing of a canal worker. The other was black, older, with gray in his hair. They were arguing in low voices. Amos couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. The white man wanted to leave. The black man was insisting they wait. Amos watched, his heart hammering. Was this the boat? The one the stranger had told him about? Or was it just a random canal barge, and those men would turn him in the moment they saw him? He had no way to know. The white man threw up his hands in frustration and walked toward the back of the boat. The black man stayed at the front, looking out into the darkness. Looking, Amos realized, like he was waiting for someone. Amos made his decision. He stood up, slowly, water streaming from his clothes. He raised his hands so they could see he wasn't armed, wasn't dangerous. Then he stepped out of the reeds. The black man saw him immediately. His hand went to something at his belt, a knife, probably, but he didn't draw it. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then the man said, very quietly, "You, Amos?" Amos's legs nearly gave out. "Yes." The man nodded. "Get on. Quick." Amos waded into the canal and pulled himself up onto the barge. The moment his feet touched the deck, the white man came back, saw him, and swore. "Christ, Moses, he's half drowned. He gonna make it?" The black man, Moses, was already untying the ropes. "He'll make it. Get us moving." "Who's after him?" "Whoever it is, they're too close. Move." The white man grabbed a long pole and started pushing the barge away from the bank. Moses helped, and within seconds they were gliding down the canal, the current carrying them north. Amos collapsed against a pile of cargo, sacks of something, grain maybe, and tried to catch his breath. Moses crouched beside him. "You hurt?" Amos shook his head. Couldn't speak yet. "We got about 4 hours to Norfolk. You stay down, stay quiet. There's patrols on the canal sometimes, and if they see you, we're all dead." Amos nodded. Moses stood, then paused. "You got family back there?" Amos's throat closed. He managed one word. "Yes." Moses's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. "Most do." He turned away. Amos lay there on the deck, staring up at the sky. The mist was clearing. He could see stars now, more stars than he'd ever seen in his life. Behind him, somewhere in the dark, men with dogs were searching for a slave who'd vanished into the swamp. Behind him, in a cabin on a plantation he'd never see again, his wife and children were waking to find him gone. Ahead was unknown. But it was north. The canal journey was a blur. Amos drifted in and out of consciousness, too exhausted to stay alert. Once he woke to voices. A patrol had stopped the barge, was asking the white man questions. Amos lay perfectly still beneath a tarp Moses had thrown over him, barely breathing, while Boots walked across the deck, inches from his head. Then the voices faded. The barge moved on. Another time he woke to daylight. Moses was sitting nearby, eating a piece of bread. He saw Amos watching and offered him some. Amos took it, ate it mechanically. It tasted like nothing. "How much further?" Amos asked. "Hour, maybe less." Moses studied him. "You ever been in a city before?" "No." "Norfolk's big. Lots of people, lots of noise. You'll need to be careful. Can't trust everyone just because they're black. Some folks make money turning in runaways." Amos absorbed this. "What happens when we get there?" "There's a ship. Leaves tonight for Philadelphia. Captain's sympathetic to the cause. He'll hide you in the hold till you're clear of Virginia waters." "And then?" Moses shrugged. "Then you're in Pennsylvania. Free state. You'll have to figure out the rest yourself." Amos looked at this man who'd risked his life to pull a stranger out of a swamp. "Why are you doing this?" Moses was quiet for a long time. Then, "I got out 20 years ago. Made it to Philadelphia. Built a life. But I couldn't stay there knowing what I knew. Couldn't just be free while others weren't." "So you came back." "Someone has to." Moses stood. "Get some rest. You'll need your strength." Norfolk appeared through the morning haze like something from a dream. Amos had never seen so many buildings in his life. Warehouses lined the waterfront, their brick faces dark with soot. Ships crowded the harbor, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, their masts like a forest of bare trees. The noise was overwhelming, shouts in a dozen languages, hammers on metal, wagon wheels on cobblestones, gulls screaming overhead. Moses guided the barge to a quiet dock away from the main traffic. The white man, whose name Amos never learned, helped Amos onto the dock, then immediately pushed off again without a word. Moses led Amos through a maze of alleys and back streets. They passed other black people, some enslaved, wearing the rough clothes Amos recognized, others free, dressed in city clothes Amos had never seen before. No one gave them a second glance. In a city this big, apparently, two black men walking together wasn't worth noticing. They reached a warehouse near the water. Moses knocked 3 times, paused, knocked twice more. The door opened. A woman stood there, young, light-skinned, with sharp eyes that took in Amos's appearance in one quick glance. "This him?" Moses nodded. "Needs to be on the Evening Star tonight." The woman stepped aside. "Inside, quick." The warehouse was full of cargo, crates and barrels stacked to the ceiling. But in the back, hidden behind a false wall, was a small room with a half-dozen people sitting on the floor. All of them were runaways. Amos could tell by their faces, by the way they looked at him. Recognition, fear, exhaustion, hope, all mixed together. The woman pointed to an empty spot. "Sit. Don't talk. Ship leaves at midnight. You'll be in the hold for 3 days. There's water, some food. It won't be comfortable, but you'll live." Then she was gone, and Moses with her. Amos sat down among the strangers and pulled his knees to his chest. He was still wearing the same clothes he'd left the plantation in, still had the bundle at his belt, though the cornmeal was ruined and the rope was gone, lost somewhere in the swamp. All he had left was the file, the broken, useless file. He pulled it out, looked at it for a moment, then set it aside. He didn't need it any more. Midnight came. The runaways were led in pairs to a ship docked at the far end of the wharf. The Evening Star was a merchant vessel, medium-sized, unremarkable. A sailor met them at the gangplank, didn't ask names, didn't ask questions, just gestured for them to follow. Below deck, beneath the cargo hold, was a space so low you had to crawl. It was dark, airless, and already crowded with people who'd been brought aboard earlier. Amos squeezed into a corner and sat with his back against the hull. The wood was damp, cold. He could hear water on the other side, could feel the ship rocking gently. The hatch closed above them. The darkness became absolute. Someone near Amos whispered, "First time running?" Amos's voice was rough. "Yes." "Where you from?" "Virginia, Southampton County." "Long way." The voice paused. "You leave family?" Amos closed his eyes. "Yes." The voice went quiet. Then, "Most of us did." Somewhere in the hold, a woman was crying. Quiet, trying to muffle it, but Amos could hear. He understood. Because the tears he'd been holding back for 14 days were finally coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. He cried silently in the dark, surrounded by strangers who were crying too, while above them the ship prepared to leave the only land any of them had ever known. The journey north took 4 days. In the hold beneath the cargo, time lost all meaning. There was no light, no sense of day or night. Food and water were lowered down twice a day, but that was the only way to mark time's passage. The air was thick, barely breathable. People got sick. Some from seasickness, others from the confinement, others from infections and injuries they'd sustained during their escapes. A man near Amos developed a fever on the 2nd day. By the 3rd day he was delirious, calling out names, his wife, his children, his mother. On the 4th day he went quiet. When the hatch finally opened and a sailor told them they could come up, the man didn't move. He'd made it to freedom, but he'd died before seeing it. 2 sailors carried his body up. They would bury him at sea, Amos learned later. No name, no marker, just another soul the system had taken. Philadelphia. Amos stood on the dock in the early morning light and stared at a city he couldn't begin to comprehend. Buildings taller than any he'd imagined, streets wider than plantation roads, and people, so many people, black and white, moving past each other like it was nothing. A woman from a Quaker Aid Society met the runaways at the dock. She was older, white, with kind eyes and a clipboard. She asked each person their name and where they'd come from, gave them a paper with an address, a boarding house that would give them a place to stay for a few nights while they figured out what came next. When she got to Amos, he gave his name, told her Southampton County, Virginia. She wrote it down, then looked up. "You have people here? Family? Friends?" "No." "Skills? Can you read?" "No." She nodded, no judgment in her expression. "The boarding house will help you find work. There's a community here, black folks who've been where you are. They'll help you get on your feet." She handed him the paper with the address and moved on to the next person. Amos stood there, holding the paper he couldn't read, in a city he didn't know, and felt more lost than he'd felt in the swamp. The boarding house was run by a free black man named William Still. Still was in his late 20s, educated, meticulous. He kept records of every fugitive who came through Philadelphia, their names, where they'd come from, where they hoped to go. "Someday," he told Amos, "when this is all over, people will want to know, will want to understand what it took." Amos stayed at the boarding house for 3 weeks. He found work at a shipyard loading cargo. The pay was small, but it was pay, actual money, wages for his labor. The concept was so foreign it took days to sink in. He shared a room with 2 other men, both runaways from Maryland. They taught him how to navigate the city, how to avoid certain streets where slave catchers were known to operate, how to carry himself like a free man, head up, eyes forward, moving with purpose. At night, Amos lay on a real bed with a real pillow and stared at the ceiling. He thought about Delphine, wondered if she knew he'd made it, wondered if the overseers had punished her after his escape, or if Red Hill had been pragmatic enough to recognize she couldn't have stopped him. He thought about Ruth and Josiah, wondered if they remembered him, if Delphine told them stories about their father who'd walked north. He thought about going back for them. It was impossible, of course. Virginia had gotten more dangerous after the Fugitive Slave Act. Bounty hunters operated openly now. Even free blacks weren't safe. But still, the thought persisted. The plan that couldn't work, but wouldn't die. 2 months after arriving in Philadelphia, Amos received news. William Still called him into his office one evening. There was a letter on the desk. "This came from a contact in Virginia," Still said. "Southampton County." Amos's heart stopped. It's about your family." Still's face was gentle. "I'm sorry. Your wife and children were sold 2 weeks after you left. Red Hill sold them to a trader heading to the deep south, Mississippi most likely." The room tilted. Amos heard himself ask, "Are they alive?" "I don't know. The contact lost the trail after they were sold. It's possible, if you had resources, if you could hire someone to search." "I have nothing," Amos said. His voice sounded far away. "I have nothing." Still nodded. "I'm sorry." Amos stood, walked out of the office, out of the boarding house, into the Philadelphia night. He walked for hours, through streets he didn't know, past buildings that all looked the same, surrounded by people who were free, and didn't understand what that freedom had cost. He'd made it. He was alive. He was free. And his family was gone, sold into the deep South, where slavery was even more brutal, even more total, where the chances of ever seeing them again were so small as to be meaningless. Amos found himself at the docks, staring out at the water. He could go back, could try to find them. It would almost certainly mean recapture, enslavement, probably death, but he'd be trying. Or he could stay, build a life here, survive. Maybe someday earn enough money to hire someone to search. Maybe, in some impossible future, find a way to buy their freedom, if they were still alive, if they could be found. If. Amos stood there until dawn, watching the sun rise over free soil, and felt no warmth from it at all. 10 years later, Philadelphia, 1860. Amos was 42 years old. He'd built a life of sorts. He still worked at the shipyard, had moved up to a supervisory position. He had a small apartment. He attended a church for black Philadelphians. He had acquaintances, though he'd never call them friends. He'd never married again, never even considered it. He sent money south whenever William Still had a reliable contact. Small amounts, to be used for bribing slave catchers or paying for forged papers. He didn't know if any of it helped. Didn't know if Delphine or Ruth or Josiah were even alive. But he sent the money anyway. One evening in November, Still sent word that he needed to see Amos immediately. When Amos arrived at Still's office, there was a woman there, young, maybe 19 or 20, light brown skin, sharp eyes. She looked at Amos for a long moment. Then she said, "You don't remember me." Amos stared at her, his mind racing. The woman smiled, sad. "I was 6 the last time I saw you. Too young to remember much. But Mama told me about you, told me everything." Amos's voice broke. "Ruth?" Ruth nodded. "I got out 3 months ago. Took me this long to make it here." She paused. "Mama's gone. Died 2 years ago. Fever." The room spun. "And Josiah?" "Still in Mississippi. I tried to get him to run with me, but he wouldn't leave his wife. He's got children now. Your grandchildren." Amos couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Ruth crossed the room and took his hand. "Mama said to tell you, if I ever found you, that she knew. She knew you made it. And she told us every night, told Josiah and me, that our daddy walked north until his feet touched free ground." The tears came then, after 10 years of holding them back. Amos collapsed into a chair and wept while his daughter held him. This woman he didn't know, this child he'd left behind. "I'm sorry," he managed. "I'm so sorry." Ruth's voice was firm. "Don't be. You did what you had to, and Mama never blamed you, never once." They sat together in Still's office while the city moved around them. 2 people who'd survived what should have killed them, reunited by a miracle that was also a tragedy. Because Ruth was free, but Josiah wasn't. Delphine was dead. The family Amos had left behind was scattered, broken, changed beyond recognition. And Amos was free. But freedom, he'd learned, wasn't the end of the story. It was just a different kind of weight to carry. The final record. William Still's Journal, December 1860. Amos, surname unknown, escaped Southampton County, Virginia, October 1850. Arrived Philadelphia same month. Currently employed as shipyard foreman. Reunited with daughter Ruth, November 1860. Son Josiah remains enslaved in Mississippi. Amos asks daily if there's a way to purchase his son's freedom. I have told him the truth. Mississippi slaveholders rarely sell to northern buyers, and the political situation makes such transactions nearly impossible. He knows this, but he asks anyway. Some men carry freedom lightly. Others carry it like a stone. Amos is the latter. Epilogue. What we know. The historical record shows that a man named Amos worked at a Philadelphia shipyard from 1850 until his death in 1879. He was known as a quiet man, reliable, who sent most of his wages south through abolitionist networks. His daughter Ruth married a carpenter in 1862 and had 3 children. She lived to see the end of slavery, the end of the Civil War, the beginning of Reconstruction. His son Josiah was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. He moved to Memphis after the war, opened a small shop, and died in 1889. Whether Josiah and Amos ever saw each other again, the records don't say. What we know is this. On a night in October 1850, a man named Amos walked away from everything he loved and into a darkness that could have killed him. He made it. He survived. But survival, for men like Amos, was never simple, was never clean, was never without cost. He carried his family with him for the rest of his life, in memory, in guilt, in love that distance couldn't diminish and time couldn't erase. The night he left, Delphine told him, "I'll know you made it." She was right. He made it. But what he found on the other side of freedom was both more and less than he'd imagined. A life, yes. Safety, yes. But also an emptiness that no amount of time could fill. Still, he'd made the choice, and he'd lived. That was something. In a world designed to kill him, to break him, to reduce him to a line in a ledger, Amos had lived. And that, for one man who'd been born property and died free, was everything.